Welcome to Awakening Within. I'm your host, Jill McPherson. If you're in a long-term intimate relationship, then you'll want to tune in to today's show because we are discussing intimate relationships, sex, and ethical loving. I have with me today a dear friend who happens to be a registered psychotherapist and a clinical sex therapist. She has been helping individuals and couples explore and heal sexual issues or challenges in their lives and relationships for over 30 years. She has such an open-minded, non-judgmental approach that I absolutely love, so I just had to have her come on my show and discuss some sexual issues that many of us find challenging to discuss, particularly with our own lover. So I would love to welcome you to Kersty Franklin. Thanks for coming in to talking to us in the studio.
Nice to be here, Jill.
So, long-term intimate relationships can be quite challenging because, things get stale or, there isn't that communication. So what do you often see, first of all, as far as your clients that come in, what's sort of the challenge?
Well, as a clinical sex therapist, people come to me sometimes asking to have more orgasms and sometimes asking to have less. I see everything in the entire gamut of sexuality, from people who want to explore open relationships, polyamory, ethical loving, to people who are convinced that their partner or loved one is a sex addict. So sometimes it's teasing out the differences between sexual addiction and people who just want to be more open in their loving relationships. That's the entire spectrum.
So Kirsty, you're the first person I ever heard use this term called ethical loving. And I want to know what's the difference for you between ethical loving versus a sexual addiction? Or can we kind of get into explaining the difference of those two?
Absolutely. So sexual addiction is when someone's sexual behaviors get them in some type of trouble, whether that's with their family or their work or their social lives. They find that they are spending much more of their time and energy involved in the pursuit of sexual relationships, usually in secret and to the exclusion of their primary partner.
Right.
Ethical loving is about making clear choices about being open and honest and direct about what your sexual needs are. So for example, if you are a person that has a really high sex drive and your partner has a really low sex drive or possibly even no sexual desire, in an ethical loving relationship, the higher sex drive person might say, I'd like to explore being sexual with other people. That doesn't necessarily mean they are polyamorous or even polysexual, but maybe they just want to try opening their relationship up so that they can discover being sexual with other people. That's what an ethical, loving relationship is.
So I want to say the word negotiating, almost like you're saying, these are my needs, I recognize your needs, and because we're not fulfilling each other's needs, can we still stay together? Like, this is still staying together.
Absolutely.
But figuring out how needs can be met while still staying in this primary relationship.
That's part of it. I think the very first part of it is helping people to really talk out loud about their sexual needs. We still live, even in this era of sex everywhere, we're still bound by those old sort of moral traditions of the Judeo-Christian ethic that, relationships are to be always monogamous, always between a woman and her male partner, and it doesn't leave much flexibility for all of the various types of roles and genders and sexual preferences that many of us have. And so getting people to talk out loud about who they are as sexual beings is the first step. And then absolutely negotiating what those sexual needs might be with your partner.
Right, because even being able to talk out loud, there's likely so much hesitation over, because I have these needs that are outside of this sort of maybe cultural paradigm of this is what a loving sexual relationship looks like, and these are the details and the behaviors that involve that, being, as you said, often monogamy, often only certain kind of sex, we'll call it. But you're helping couples to see if you can work through that communication barrier.
Yes, and I think that sometimes people come into the office with sort of an idea that there is a way to contract sexual behaviors, and that's certainly a step for some people. Some people need to have very, very clearly defined boundaries around who they are as sexual beings, as a partner in a relationship, as a human being with very diverse sexual needs. And sometimes partners come in because they think that their partner is broken, and that the real reality of coming to a sex therapist is to fix the broken party.
Right, and that agenda doesn't work.
That agenda doesn't work.
Right.
I've never met any broken people. I've met people with deep wounds. I've met people with lots of trauma. I've met people with lots of misguided and mistaught beliefs around who they are around sexual beings. But people aren't broken, and they don't need to be fixed. What they need to find usually is a way to discover and uncover who they are as sexual beings. And we don't teach ways to have people talk out loud about what that might look like.
Right. So a lot of times, they could be struggling, that even lack of sex drive that you talk about that can happen in a couple, that can even just come from the fact that they may have misinformation or experiences that has shut that part of themselves down. So they could even come to just to discover that there's blocks there for them. That
Yes, I think the other piece of that is that our society has always looked at that sex is normative, that if you have a high desire, you have no sexual difficulties in a relationship, you can always orgasm satisfactorily, that those are the things that most of us have always. And that's a myth. Most of us at some point in our lives struggle with sexual desire, struggle with knowing what our preferences are, struggle with the ability to say, I like that a lot, or no, I don't like that. And to find ways to help people, again, really be comfortable about voicing what is going on inside themselves of a sexual nature, and how to dialogue about that with your partner.
Right. So it's not about deciding any sort of judgment about right or wrong.
Absolutely.
It's about giving them the skills they need to communicate effectively about what's happening for them.
Right.
Wow.
And remember that, thankfully, Kinsey showed us back in the 50s that human sexual nature is not a binary. It is not, I'm heterosexual, I'm homosexual, I can be any flavor in between. And we are greatly varied in our abilities to relate to each other sexually, with some people being able to do it very easily and comfortably, and some people having a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety about what that whole concept of being a sexual human being means.
Wow. So having labels and categories is actually causing a lot of distress. When you're saying it's more of a fluid thing, it's not put us in the box of I'm this, I'm that, I'm not this, I'm not that. It's about recognizing that as humans, we have more of a fluidity of like preferences, desires, drive, changes all the time.
Yes.
If your partner is not in the room, you may want to grab him or her and stay tuned for more discussion about ethical loving and creating the sex life you want. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Awakening Within. We are here discussing ethical loving with my guest, Kersty Franklin. Thanks for being here to discuss a sensitive topic, yet one we often need to be discussing in our own sexual relationships. So thank you. Kersty, I wanted to have you on the show because One of the things I've noticed through my own healing journey and also through professionally, when I've also seen clients in my office as well, is the struggle that we have when we're stuck in a belief system that says, my life has to be this way and my partner's life has to be this way. You know, one of my previous guests, Eric, often will tease me about helping me recognize that I have an agenda for my husband. And really, I mean, like, often, who doesn't have an agenda for their partner, right?
Right.
I mean, if only they did what I wanted them to do in order so that I could be happy, right? And so taking that chronic habit, I think, that many of us have when we get into long-term relationships, of you need to be this way and you can't be that way. If we take that into the context of our sexual relationships, what I'm hoping that we get out of today is to invite the viewers to be open to the possibility that you could see outside of a long-term belief system that says a marriage or long-term commitment, intimate relationship is this, this, and this, and not that, that, and that. Would you say that that's what you help people with a lot, is sort of being open or getting curious about, could there be another way? Because I think what I'm seeing is that when this does happen, when people aren't open, it becomes an all or none. It becomes either we follow this set of rules that we were, raised with, that our society, our religion, our culture says is a long-term marriage or relationship, or we're out.
Right.
And there's either or. And I just think of how many marriages or relationships could be saved if they could just be willing to get open and get curious about seeing their sexual relationship in a new way.
I love the way you're using the words "get curious," because that's exactly what I do. I think that traditionally we have been taught that if we are in a loving relationship, that relationship must look one way. Whether we're in a heterosexual, a homosexual, a genderless relationship, it doesn't really matter. We have this intrinsic belief that a loving relationship must look one way, and usually that means monogamy. Mm-hmm. And truly, monogamy works for many, many people. Mm-hmm. But what happens is that sometimes it doesn't. And you're right, many people end up leaving relationships because they cannot tolerate the idea that their partner could be still madly, wildly in love with them, want to be with them, want to continue a life with them, but they might want to explore being sexual with somebody else. And that can be a variety of things. There's so many different structures and types of relationships that people build. Anything from an open relationship to people learning to be perhaps bringing in the swinging option, which is very different from being polyamorous, which means being able to love more than one.
Right. So what would, just to clarify then, what would you say is an open relationship? When you say open, what does that mean?
An open relationship is typically where a committed couple agrees that one or both of them are allowed to have sexual relationships outside of that monogamous boundary or their relationship. They're allowed to be open. Sometimes that's with very explicit rules, meaning that you can only go one time a month with somebody else, and sometimes it's fully open and allows people lots of differentiation around what their sexual behaviors look like. That would be an open relationship. A polyamorous relationship typically is really more around a loving situation, which is different from being open, although some poly relationships are also open. So a poly relationship might look like, I remember my very first introduction to the world of polyamory. I was working on my doctoral degree in San Francisco, and a professor walked in and introduced herself to the class, and as part of her introduction, she said she lived with both her husband and her boyfriend. I was 19 years old, and I remember thinking, oh,
yeah, how could that be?
You can do that? Where do I sign up for that? Right?
So she's living in the same house with her husband and her boyfriend.
That's correct. And I immediately at the end of the class, I went up to her and I said, would you be willing to talk more about that? And she said, you'll hear more about that because I'm a strong proponent of the concept of polyamory. And so that was my very first introduction, which was now over 40 years ago. And I have lived and learned so much since that time, and I'm constantly astonished at how willing people are to really dig deeper about who they are as sexual beings. And certainly the young people of today have such a broader range of acceptance around differences, whereas in my generation, you couldn't even broach a possibility of being sexual with someone other than your primary partner or your husband or wife. And today, I would say my practice is made up about 50% of the people that come to me for sexual difficulties are around this concept of one person being monogamish and the other one being monogamous. And how do we begin to tease out all those feelings of jealousy and inadequacy, and this is about something being wrong with me that you would want to seek another partner.
Taking it so personally, somebody else's sexual desires and needs, taking it personally, like I must not be good enough.
Exactly. And it's almost never about that.
No.
It's about differing needs.
Okay, that's great. We are having a great discussion. We are not done, so stay tuned and we will be right back. Welcome back to Awakening Within. If you haven't already noticed, I have a thing about communication. I can't get enough of helping people communicate more effectively, particularly myself. That's where it starts. We are taking communication into the context of sexual desire, and I have with me registered psychotherapist Kersty Franklin, clinical sex therapist, who helps couples with that communication required in order to have an effective sex life. And so I want to talk about that, how, we've just sort of lightly touched on it, but how it just even starts when you see couples realizing that often they're not even able to talk about sex or communicate their needs or desires with their partner. So starting there as far as being able to talk about it. And I just find it, unbelievably, it almost feels unbelievably sad for me that, we are raised in this culture where we're still today struggling to even talk about sex. So give me an example of like how you might start helping couples even just communicate about sex.
Okay, so imagine this, Jill. Imagine if I said to everybody that was here in the studio today, yourself, all your production crew, imagine if I said, I want you to think for a second about your wildest sexual fantasy. I want you to really spend a couple of seconds imagining your favorite sexual fantasy that you've never shared with another human being. And now I'd like your production crew and everybody else on the set and maybe every member in the audience to turn to somebody and tell them what that was.
Yeah.
Right? So most
like,
people's,
oh dear.
Exactly, their stomach begins to drop. Well,
Right.
sometimes when people come into my office, they also have never spoken out loud about anything related to who they are as sexual beings. So they don't talk about where they like to be touched, how they like to be touched, how fast, how slow. And certainly if there's been a place or a space where they're unhappy in their sex life, oftentimes they've never told that to anybody, including themselves. So sometimes it's a matter of coaching people on talking about, firstly, what are their sexual needs? There's often a lot of tears in my office as people come to an awareness of they have absolutely no idea of who they are as sexual beings. And so when their partner has a suggestion that they open their sex life up more, the first feeling is a threat. It's a loss. It's a sense of, I'm not enough. And many times that comes from, just like you said, all these old beliefs that sex is done this way and that there are no other possibilities. And so Sometimes I have to split couples up for a little bit and talk individually to people about how comfortable they can be. I'm a very directive sex therapist. I help people voice things that have previously been unsaid,
Right.
and help them acknowledge where they are. I would never presume to suggest that one way of being sexual is the right way. There are so many diversities and varieties in our life in everything. Why would we presume that we're all going to be the exact same sexually?
Right, right. So you're helping couples not decide what's right, but decide what is it that you
Where are
want,
they? Right.
you know, where are you at, and then how can I help guide the two of you communicate to meet those needs or to have your needs met, or
Right. Well, that's part of it, but I think sometimes people come in with an agenda that they're not always really clear on. So maybe they come in believing that they want to have an open relationship, but what that turns out to really mean is they want to be able to have sex with other people and never have to talk about that to anybody, just sort of fulfill their own need, never have to be accountable in any way to their partner, and their partner feels very excluded, very left out, and can't wrap their head around why somebody else may want to be sexual with someone other than the person that they love.
right,
And many people like sexual variety. It doesn't even need an emotional connection or a loving connection. And so helping people really be clear about what their agenda is. If one person says, I recognize I'm polyamorous and I've told this to my partner of 20 years, and all of a sudden now she's telling me that if I'm going to have sex with other people, she wants out. And so I need you to help her understand, or him understand, how important it is for me to be true to my sexual self. And I'm really clear with those people that coming to a sex therapist isn't like having a fairy godmother tap you on your head.
Could you fix my partner for me, please?
Exactly, right? It's about really learning to communicate what your needs are and understanding that sometimes in a relationship, your needs cannot be met by the other person. And you either can choose to negotiate how to make that work, or you may have to decide that being together isn't the healthiest option for either of you, especially if one person is going to continue to have to live a life in secrecy because their partner can't wrap their head around the fact that the other person wishes to be sexual with more than just them.
Right. And I mean, a life of secrecy in a relationship, I mean, we often right away we think of affairs, and that's likely where that's come from. I mean, an affair type behavior is a symptom of lack of communication in many cases.
Absolutely.
Right? So if only they could have communicated their needs, but if they thought it was it's this or nothing, it's this or I have to secretly do something else behind my partner's back,
Right.
Instead having that effective communication could completely avoid affair altogether.
What I have found, not only is that true, but I have found that in couples who really, really explore who they are as sexual beings, just knowing that they have the freedom to say, well, I'm thinking maybe I would like to be sexual with somebody else, and then having the opportunity to talk about that, not having it instantly shut down or a door closed, or saying that you have a sexual addiction problem, or that your sexual behavior is pathologized,
Yeah,
right? Versus my needs because I am, sticking to the box.
Right. I'm normal. I'm,
Right.
right, or something like that.
So this is a conversation for people who are not faint-hearted. It is scary. It is threatening. But I believe in a loving relationship, usually I can help people to see how it's more important to really connect about not just like what a bottom line is, but whether we can really negotiate a new boundary for something that we've been not able to talk about for a very long time.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Kersty. I want to thank you for being in with us today, and when we come back, I'll take a moment to reflect and give you my thoughts on what we've talked about today. Stay with us. I remember watching a Dr. Phil show once where he talked about the main reasons for marriage breakups. One of the most common is incompatibility in their sex lives. one person wants a lot of sex while the other person doesn't want any, or the marriage becomes sexless, or somewhere along the line there's an affair. Many of these challenges end in divorce. Given that there are multiple sexual challenges in long-term relationships, I can't help but wonder, what can we do about this? Could many of these relationship breakups be avoided if they had been open to asking for what they wanted, as well as being open-minded enough to accommodate a partner's requests that may at first seem odd or perhaps wrong according to their upbringing? I also can't help but wonder if we approached our sexual needs without a mind filled with judgment about right or wrong, what would happen then? What if we just got curious? What if we just learned to listen to our partners and to decide to write our own ideas on what ethical sex is, rather than turning to people or groups outside of our relationships to tell us what is okay and what is not? Now, there's something to consider. I'm Jill McPherson, and I wish you all well on your journey of awakening within. Thanks for watching.